Welcome everyone as we start at the two dots on the bottom of Daf Kuv Zayin Amud Beis. Two dots on the bottom of Kuv Zayin Amud Beis. And it is 9 lines from the bottom. If you remember, we learned that there were pushkas in the Beis Hamikdash that held the shkalim. And there were different pushkas marked for different purposes. These pushkas were called shofarais, because like a shofar, they were wide on the bottom and narrow on the top. So Tanan Hossam, we learned in Masech Shkalim, Shisha Nedava. There were 6 pushkas marked for Nedava. That's when the business was slow on the Mizbeach. So they would take money from there to buy carbon oila l'kayet hamizbeach. Keneged me. Why were there 6? What was the purpose of 6? Amachizke keneged shisha batei avos hakohanim. We know that there were 24 mishmos. Each mishma was then subdivided into 6 batei avos that operated Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And so each shofar was for a different one of the batei avos. Shetiknu lehem chacham, the chacham enacted sheish shalom zeh zeh, that they should have peace one with another. Each day they took from, because the Kohanim would keep the hides of the oilos that were brought. Rabbi Yochanan says it was simply a operational necessity. Mitochsha nedava meruba, since many shkalim were put in for nedava, tiknu lehem shofris merubin, they made many pushkas, kedei shelo yisapshu amois, in order that the money should not become rotten. Ziri says it's keneged the 6 korbanos that are possible for an oila: par, a bull; ve'egel, a calf; ayil, a ram; a keves, a lamb. Ayil is 2 years old, a keves is 1 year old; gedi, a kid which is 1 year old; and a sar which is 2 year old. V'rebihi, and it's going according to Rebbe, though it says that even if you say cotton, you cannot bring a gadol. Damar cotton, baby gadol lo yatsa. Ubar pada amar, Bar Pada says, well, keneged, one pushka was keneged aparim va'elim, bulls and rams of the community that were lost, and when they offered another one and then they found it, so then they waited for it to get a mum, and then they sold it and put the leftovers into the pushka mark nedava. Vakvasim, and one was for the lambs of an oshim of a nazir, where his lamb was lost. Vaseirim is for the communal musafin, the goats of the communal musafin that were lost. V'amaisarais, and one was for surplus. In other words, if they put aside money for a carbon and the price went down and they had left over. And one was, this is a quite unusual pshat, one was fa'ama'ah. The din is that usually when you brought your machzis shekel, you gave a kolban. The kolban is where it was an extra surcharge in case there wasn't a sufficient amount of silver in your shekel. Now they said that if you give for yourself and for someone else, you only give 1 kolban. But in order that hektish shouldn't lose out, you give another kolban, but it's not part of the normal machzis shekel, so it goes in for kayet hamizbeach. So now the Gemara says, why didn't each one say like the other? Kulu kechizkiya like amrei, because we're not worried that they're going to fight. The kol chad v'chad you make of it. each one gets the oilus of its day. There's no need for fighting. Each one gets the oilus that were brought on that base of's day. So Sunday gets Sunday's oilus. Because we're not worried that coins are going to get spoiled. We were not worried that coins are going to get spoiled. Because then you have to have one for a big animal and one for a small animal, which means if you set a small animal, you cannot bring a big animal, but that's only a Shittas Yachid, it's only Rabbi. Ki Yechidah loy mukmei. They don't want to say like Yechidah. Kabar Poda Nami loy Imrei. Because what do you mean, Moisaras? That there's a special pushka for surplus. Kulu Nami Moisaras. The others are also a surplus. If an animal gets lost and you offered it up, this second animal is a Meiser. And another problem with Bar Pada is Ma'anami Lishkalim Ozla. The extra kolban goes to the shkalim. The Tanya Leich and kolban Zehailich. Where does the extra kolban go? Lishkalim Divrei Meir, Rabbi Lazar Aimal in the Dava. The extra one goes in the Dava. So they hold that it goes Lishkalim, and therefore you don't need a pushka for that. Now another reason why you need 6. Ushmolaimer keneged meiser chatas. One is if you had extra for the money that you set aside for a chatas, and one is for meiser ashim. If you have extra for the money that you set aside for an ashim meila or an ashim gezelis, or meiser ashim nazir, which is not for kapara, but rather that he should be able to start his count again, or meiser ashim mitzaira, which is also not for kapara, but in order that he should be able to enter back into the machana, or ma'isa minchas chayte, and for the extra of the minchas chayte, if you separated the minchas chayte and you had a surplus, or ma'isa afsirus eifishal kohen gadol, and the surplus for the chavite kohen gadol that's offered every day. Then another explanation of the 6, Reb Aishi Aimer, Keneged Meiser Chatas, the surplus of Chatas, and Meiser Ashim, the surplus of Ashim, that's Ashim Gezelis and Ashim Ilis, which is for Kapara, or Meiser Ashim Nazir, which is different because it allows them to start counting again, or Meiser Ashim Mitzar, which is different because it allows them to come into camp, or Meiser Kinim, and the surplus, this is in honor of us starting Kinim tomorrow, or Meiser Kinim, if Yoleda set aside money for kinim and has extra, or ma'aser minchas chayte, and the surplus for minchas chayte. Now Shmuel, my time Rabbi Yishia. Why does Shmuel not say like Rabbi Yishia? So he says because there's already a pushka marked kinim tana liberation. Already in the beginning of that Mishnah in Shkalim, there's a pushka marked kinim. Rabbi Yishia, no, that there's 2 different things. One is the kinim that she puts in her money and she knows that her carbon would be offered, and one is for Maisris. Rabbi Yishia Tane, Rabbi Yishia Tane, V'loi Tani Kenan? Did he have the 13 and not teach Kenan? It says the Gemara, Tani Rabbi Yishia taught the 13 V'tani Kenan. Says the Gemara, yeah, but the first kinim is for kinei chayva, chad l'kinim v'chad l'maisa kinim. One is for the kinim, that when the woman is chayv to bring a pair of birds for a yoldus, she puts it in there and she knows that it's taken care of. And one is for the surplus, which goes for Eilas Nadava. Rabbi Yishia, my time Elohim Kishmuel. Rabbi Yishia, why didn't he say like Shmuel? You know why? Because he holds that the Meiser of the Chavite Kohen Gadol has to be left to rot. Savla command Amma Meiser shall Asiris Eifish shall Kohen Gadol Yirkav. That's to be left to rot. The Tanya Meiser Minchas Nadava Meiser Minchas Nadava. The surplus of a regular mincha goes for Kayetz HaMizbeach. Meiser Mincha, the Meiser of the Mincha of the Kohen Gadol Yirkav. Now, I just told you what it meant. My Amar, what does this cryptic statement mean? The the surplus of a minchas chayte, that's nedava. Meiser asiris eifer shel kohen gadol, that has to be yerkav, that has to rat, so you don't have, like Shmuel says, a pushka for it. Rabba Amar, afilu meiser asiris eifer shel kohen gadol nami nedava. What meiser is left to rat? Ela meiser lachmei toida yerkav. If there was a surplus from the lachmei toida, that has to rat. And that's a machloikis. The plukta. Moisa asiris eifer shel kohen gadol. Rabbi Yochanan Raman Nedava. Rabbi Yochanan says it goes into the pushka marked for kayetz mizbeach. Rabbi Lazar Amar Yerkav. Meisvei. Moisa shkolim. If let's say somebody set aside money for shkolim, and he saw he set aside extra, it's chulin. Or Meiser Asiris Eifa, the surplus of the Asiris Eifa, or Meiser Kinei Zavim, Kinei Zavais, for Kinei Yoldais, the surplus of Kinei Zavim, Kinei Zavas, Kinei Yoldas, for Chatois, for Hashamais. Meisreim, their excess is Nadava. So now when it says Asiris Eifa, isn't it talking about the Meiser of the Chavite Kohen Gadol? So it's a raya that we don't say Yerkav. My lab Meiser Asiris Eifa shel Kohen Gadol, loy. It means Meiser minchas chayte, the surplus of a minchas chayte, that has to be Yerkav. So that's a new, that goes on the dove. But the Chavite Kohen Gadol is left to rat. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So Mistavra, now Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak comes to say which is a more logical opinion. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Mistavra commander Amar Meiser Asiris Eifer shel Kohen Gadol Yerkav. Why? The Tanya, because it says about the Chavite Kohen Gadol, Lo Yasim Aleh Shemen v'Lo Yitin Aleh Levina. You don't put on it oil. You don't put on it frankincense. No. This is said about the minchas chatas, right? Lo Yasim Aleh, because since it's a minchas chatas, it's not muhuder. So Lo Yasim Aleh Shemen. You don't put on it oil. V'Lo Yitin Aleh Levina ki chatas hi. For it is a chatas. Chatas who? For it is a chatas. Probably he. Yes, it is he. Chatas he. It is a chatas. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, he kruya chatas. Only the minchas chayte is called chatas, and like a chatas, its surplus is on a dava. Ve'ein acheres kruya chatas, but not something else, not the minchas chafmitim. Limit al asiris eifer shel kohen gadol she'ein kruya chatas u'tu'una levaina, and therefore it needs frankincense. U'mede'ein kruya chatas, so therefore, unlike the surplus chatas, ma'isra yerkav, its surplus has to be left to rot. Now, Sharze Oila. If Mark says this ox is an Oila, V'nistoiv, and it got a mum, so now he can't offer it. Rather, he sells it. When he sells it, he could bring, if he wants, two. Imratze yavi badam of shnaim. Normally, if he said shazeh, he has to bring this. But if it gets a mum, and he sells it, if he wants, he could buy two for the price of one. Shnei shvarim elu oila. If Mark says these two oxen should be an oila, and v'nistavu, they get mumin. Ratze, if he wants, yavi b'dmeim echad, he could bring for a price one. Rabbi says, no, you can't do that. Rabbi, we're going to see in the Gemara, Rabbi argues on both cases. Rabbi says, you got to do what you said. Ayil ze ola. If, let's say, Mark said, this ram should be an oila, v'nistav, and it got a mum. Imratza yavi bedam of keves, he could bring instead with its money a fat lamb. Keves ze'oila, v'nistoiv, and it gets a mum. Imratza yavi bedam of ayil, he could bring with its money a cheap ram. Again, the Rebbe Yosef. Rebbe says you can't switch like that. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. How could Mark switch in midstream? V'amrit Reisha, in the previous Mishnah, we said if Mark says Shar B'mana, V'hevi Shnaim, if he brings 2 B'mana, Lo Yatza. Says the Gemara, that's if it doesn't get a mum. Shar Zeh V'nistoiv Shani. If it gets a mum, so then he could switch in midstream. Shnei Shvarim Eilu Eila V'nistavu. If he said 2 and he gets a mum, if he wants, he could bring with its money 1. The Rebbe Yosef says the Gemara, you know why? My timer, Mishum Dahavale Gadol V'hevi Cotton. It's a case where he said a big one, and he brings small ones. V'afal Gavdin Nistoiv, and even though here it's different because it got a mum, L'chadchila lo yishari Rebbe. So the Gemara says to them, why doesn't Rebbe argue in the first case too? V'lif lagnami bereisha, we switched it around in the reisha. Says the Gemara, you're right. Rebbe akula milsapar. He's arguing on both cases. V'notul l'Rabbanan, he waited till the Rabbanan until they finished their psak. Adamaske milsayu. V'ad miflag alayu. Teida, you should know the Ketani. Ayil zeh oila v'nistoiv. If this ram became an oila and it got a mum, Ratza yavi b'dam of keves zeh oila v'nistoiv, Ratza yavi b'dam of ayil, v'Rebbe Yosef, and Rebbe Yosef. So you see that Rebbe holds that even if it gets a mum, you can't switch, regardless of the condition. Shma mina. Now, what about switching from one species to another species? You know, an ayil and a keves is the same family. It's just a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. But ibayalahu memina lamina mai. What about from one species to another species? Kajma shor ze oila v'nistoiv. If a shor, he said this shor should be an oila and it gets a mum, lo yavi b'dam of ayil. It's not allowed to bring with its money a ram. Aval maybe b'dam of beis elim, but he could bring with its money 2 rams. In other words, if he said shor ze ayla, he was offering something big. If it gets a mum, he shouldn't downgrade it to an ayil, but he could do 2 elim. Rabbi Iser, Rabbi Asas Lefisha Ein Bila, because there is no mixing. In other words, when he said shar, it was only going to be 1 mincha, and now when he brings 2 elim, it's going to be 2 minchas. So you can't do that. Shma mina. Says the Gemara, ihachi. If so, if you could go from one min to another min, ma'yer your tray, why aren't you only allowed to bring 2 rams? Afilu chad nami. Dahabin istav, where it got a mum l'Rabbanan lo shani lu ben gadol l'katan. They don't make a difference between a big one and a small one. He said that you could say shar zeh, and you could bring an ayil. So they don't make a difference between a big one and a small one. So then if it's allowed, you should be able to bring 1 ayil. Why do you have to bring 2 ayilim? So the Gemara says, you're right, trei tanoi valibed rabbanan. It's a machlokes 2 tanoim according to rabbanan, whether you have to make it at least commensurate. Instead of a shar, 2 ayilim. Rabbi Isa lefisha ein bila. Says Gemara, that's the reason why Rabbi asks? Time of the ein bila, because one is 1 mincha and one is 2 minachas. Hayesh bila shari, but if it would be the same amount of minachas, it's permitted. V'tanan ayil zeh oilav v'nistoiv, ratzi b'dam of Yavi b'dam of keves ze oila v'nistav ratzi yavi b'dam of ayil v'Rebbe Yosef. So here Rebbe asks, even if it's only one mincha apiece, says Gemara trei tanoi v'aliv Rebbe. It's like the two opinions according to Rebbe. Now, ubitahirin, when the animal does not have a mum, egel, if he said a calf, vehevi par, or keves vehevi ayil, he makes an upgrade, yotza. This is according to the Shita Rabbanan, that if he said cotton and he brings a gadol, it's good. And that's stomach Rabbanan. That's a stam mishnah like the Rabbanan. Ratza yavi b'dam of beis, Elam, in other words, if he said a shar and he got a mum, if he wants, he could bring 2 rams. Now the Gemara starts slicing and dicing the language. Slicing and dicing the language. Amar Rav Menachos bar Zvid, Amar Rav, lo yishanu ela the Amar shar ze oila. However, if he says, Aval Amar shar ze alai ola, so he's accepting upon himself an oila, hukva. So then he can't bring 2 elam. Says the Gemara, well, maybe alai means just alai lahavi oy. I accept upon myself to bring it. Kamer. We have to be a little bit more precise. Amar Rav Menachos bar Zvid, Amar Rav lo yishanu Amar shar ze oila, inami Amar shar ze alai oila. Aval Omer shar ze v'damav alai oila. This shar, or its value, if it gets a mum and it's traded in, has to be an oila. So then hukva, and then he has to bring a shar, and he can't bring anything else. Now, is Shifty here tonight? Yeah, there he is. When I say Shifty, I'm not talking about Shiftei Yisrael. I'm talking about Eddie Chazan. Everybody knew that. I'm getting towards the edge over here, and I didn't say our sponsors, Shalom Fogel, Lili Nishmas Yaakov Zeb ben Yodaya, Rivka Bas Yaakov Yosef, Tivya Miriam Bas God, Yosef ben Tzim ben Yaakov Zeb, L'Refur Shalema for Moshe Arya ben Miriam, and for a great shidduch for Chaya Tivya Bas Shoshana Gittel, a great shidduch for Batya Bas Sarah, by Baruch Ian, Lili Nishmas Yaakov Chaim ben Abba, Esther Bas Yona, Avram ben Shmuel HaKohen, L'Refur Shalema for Liba Bas Anya, and L'Refur Shalema for Yosef Shmuel ben Miriam, and for a great healthy mommy, healthy baby for Ariel Sarah, right? It's Ariel Sarah?
Simcha.
Ariel Simcha. Ariel Simcha. Bas Elza Rivka. That's coming up soon?
Beginning of June, Bezrat Hashem.
Baruch Hashem. Ariel Simcha. Bas Elza Rivka. Also, we're going to learn the for Shalema for Pinchas Menachem ben Leah, Yitzchak Mordechai ben Esther Bracha, Yochai ben Ruchama, Mishmei ben Esther Fradel. We want to learn also the Ilui Nishmas, Menachem Mendel ben Ruvain, Neshama should have an Aliyah. Okay, so now, Ha'omer, if Eddie says, Echad mikvasai hektish. One of my sheep is hektish, but he didn't specify which one. Or the echad mishayri hektish, or one of my oxen hektish. V'hoyoloi shnayim, and he has 2. Hagadol shebehem hektish. The bigger one is hektish because you give mimivchar from your choicest. Shloisha, if it's 3. Beinani shebehem hektish. The middle one is hektish. Now the Gemara will say that here Eddie put his foot in his mouth because it might be the best one, or it might be the middle one, which is better than the worst one. So he has to give the middle one and the best one.
Why would it be the middle one?
What?
Why would it be?
Because it's better than the best one, than the worst one. He doesn't have to give the best. Pirashti, if he said, I said which one, ve'enim yodea ma pirashti, I don't know what I said, o she'amali abba, or my father told me, ve'enim yodea ma, and I don't know which one, so then I gadol shebem hektish, then the best one is hektish. That's going according to the Rabbanan, that if you say cotton and you bring the gadol, it's good. So you cover everything by bringing the best one. So what the Gemara says, it seems to be that if he said stamazoi, then we say it's the best one. Alma makdish ba'ayin yafa makdish. That means that the one that's makdish is makdish with a generous eye. So the Gemara says, yeah, but Amos Sefer, Beinani Sheben Hektish. So that means that he's now with a benevolent eye, Alma Makdish Bayin Ra Makdish, because he's not giving the best one. Amar Shmuel, no, as I told Gedalia, Chayshishin Afla Beinani. We're concerned that maybe he meant the middle one, the Gabi Cotton Ayin Yafahi. Now, what does he do that he shouldn't have to give both? Heichi Ovid. He waits until the middle one gets a mum, and he puts its kedusha on the big one, and then he just gives the big one. It's only if he said one of my oxen is hektish. The shar of my shar hektish, then I gadol shebem hektish, because he meant the most special one of my oxen. To Roy Ka'amar, he meant the most distinguished one of my oxen. Says Gemara, is that so? I v'amar Rav Huna amar Rav Chia mishmei de'ula ha'imar l'chaveiroi bayis bebeisi ani moichelach, a house amongst my house I'm selling you. Mareo aliyah, you can show him the attic. The attic is not the best. You got to walk up 2 floors. La mishum degriya, doesn't that mean he could give him one that's inferior? Says Gemara, no, aliyah means the best one, right? Like the zibaris, beininus, and aliyah. Like me'ula shebabatim. Ein achanami, when he says bayis bebeisi, he has to give the best one. Okay, another daf in the books over here at Agudas Yisrael Beis Zev. We have a Chumash here tonight, but before we do the Chumash here, we're going to count Sfira, and before we do that, I'm going to welcome in all our participants, Mel Zachter and Saba and Ruven Pollack and Yaakov Warman, and Kushner, Irving Fishbaum, Yisrael Fisher, Yitzi Fuchs, Baruch Ian, Dr. Guy, Dr. Block, Mark Franco, Dr. Yudel, Eddie Chazan, Shelley Zeitlin, Nachman Chapler, Gabriel Epstein, Moshe Lehman, Stephen Holtzman, Barish Gesseman, Shimon Klein, Yitzi Moller, Yeshua Shmuel Eisenberg, Daniel Rosenberg, Avram Rezepkowitz, Richard Rosenzweig, and David Helfgott. Here in Shul, we have Gedalia Engel and Chaim Kramer and Michal Avram and Iran and Danny Vogel and Ruven Shannon and Rebellia Yafi. And now we're going to count Svira, and then we'll have the Chumash here. Remember, if you are watching on YouTube, remember to hit subscribe. If you're interested in sponsoring Chulin, please call me at 718-916-3100, rmmwsi@aol.com. Please RSVP if you're planning to come to the Siyum at Gedalia Engel's home at 6 o'clock, which is 1 Valley Stream Lane. And if anybody wants to give money towards the Siyum, please see me or Gedalia. Also, we want to remind you to get people to join us for Chulin. What a wonderful place to start learning Daf Yomi with Masechtas Chulin. L'shem Yichud Kutcha B'richu.